Hi everyone, welcome to Guns for General Washington, chapters 7 and 8. It's just started to rain here and I know we're going to get snow, so it's a good cozy day for a read aloud. Trouble on the Lake. Loading the flat bottoms took time. First, each gun had to be dismantled, then the heavy parts had to be lashed together. The loaders also had to carefully balance the weight in each vessel. Henry's team was just what he wanted, a group of tough, muscular men who were used to hardship and danger. He also hired some local boatmen who knew the lake well. By mid-afternoon on December 9th, everything was loaded. At last, the sails were raised and they started south. William rowed in the first barge, and the others followed behind. For himself, Henry chose a fast piragua with a good pilot so he could range up and down among the moving vessels. Groaning under their loads, the boats crept through the gray water, while Will nervously tested the wind. Luckily, it was strong, whipping briskly from the northeast and filling the little sails. Even with their loads, the boats moved steadily, and Henry hoped to make the 33-mile voyage in just a few days. November had been a terribly cold month, and thick ice had formed on both shores of the lake. Here and there, big jagged ice chunks were piled up like miniature white mountains. But there was an open channel right down the center. Watching with sharp eyes, Will guided the flotilla through this middle passage. He was flattered that Henry had picked him to lead the way, but he was nervous as well. It was a big responsibility. Also, some of the men were quite a bit older than he was and might resent taking orders from him. As dusk closed in, Henry decided to find a place to stop for the night. Leaving the boats, he sailed on ahead. Suddenly, he heard a splintery crash and muffled shouts. Henry turned the piragua and raced back to the convoy. "What happened?" he shouted. "It's my fault," his brother wailed. "Blast me for a fool for my carelessness." In the growing darkness, Will had begun to daydream. He'd allowed his barge to drift, and it had run aground on hidden rocks. The damage wasn't serious, but the barge was leaking and would need repairs. Two bateaux came alongside, and cargo was shifted from the damaged scow. Several men, daring the frigid water, went over the side onto the rocks and managed to shove the boat free. Henry's pilot led the convoy to a sheltered cove called Sabbath Day Point. Luckily, it was fairly free of ice. The men ran the leaky barge up on shore, and the others dropped anchor nearby. Fires were quickly built so the ones who'd gone overboard could get warm and dry their clothes. Meanwhile, carpenters patched the damaged bow with tar and lumber brought from the fort. The barge was pushed back into the water for a test. Will breathed a long sigh of relief when it proved seaworthy. By now, everyone was exhausted, so Colonel Knox decided to stay put until morning. Canvas bags of biscuits and dried salt meat were brought ashore. Huddled around the campfires, the men settled down to a cold, uncomfortable night. Suddenly, a group of strange painted faces loomed from the surrounding bushes. "Engines!" someone shouted. Two men jumped up and scrambled for knives and muskets, ready for a fight. But it proved a false alarm. A band of Algonquins living nearby were curious about all the activity. They had come to investigate, bringing a gift with them, a haunch of roast venison. It made a fine and unexpected meal for the tired travelers. At dawn, they broke camp and the convoy set off again. Henry was worried about arrangements at the southern end of the lake. "Schuyler's supposed to have cans and oxen for us, but I don't want to take chance or lose any more time," he said to his brother. "I'll move ahead, and I'll meet you at Fort George." In his fast boat, Henry reached the fort without trouble. He found preparations underway, but William and the convoy were not so lucky. Wind currents on mountain lakes could be tricky and unpredictable. For a while, the wind had been their friend, but it began to fade. Then it picked up again, blowing hard in the opposite direction. Now they faced a problem. The bateaux were too clumsy and heavy to work against a headwind in the narrow channel. Will stood up and faced the barges behind him. "Take in your sails! Break out the sweeps!" he bellowed. "We'll have to row!" Holes had been cut on the sides of each boat in case of oars or sweeps were needed. On each vessel, the crews put the oars in place and then began to pull. It was hard, back-breaking work, but William set the pace and the men rowed steadily. Together they fought the sly wind that threatened to blow them all the way back to Fort Ticonderoga. It had been slow going before, but now their progress was even slower. Meanwhile, Colonel Knox, waiting at Fort George, was in a fever of uncertainty. A whole day passed while he walked the windswept shore, anxious to know what was happening. Finally, he sent a rider on a fast horse up the side of the lake to investigate. After several hours, the rider returned. His horse was winded, and his clothes spattered with icy mud. He reported there'd been another accident. A second barge had sprung a leak and started to go down, but the men were able to shift the cargo before the barge sank. "The boats are moving again," the rider said, "and they've only 10 more miles to go." Henry was thankful for the news, but he knew he wouldn't relax until every man and gun went ashore. Then, on the morning of the 15th, 6 days after they'd started, a thick fog drifted across the southern end of Lake George. The fog added to Henry's worries. He could do nothing but wait. He peered and paced and tried to stay calm. Where were the boats? Was Will safe? Had there been another accident? What if the guns wound up in the bottom of the lake? He stared into the fog, his fears growing. Maybe the council officers were right after all. Maybe he really was doomed to fail. The colonel groaned to himself. Had he made a blunder? Was the whole plan unrealistic? Just a vain and foolish dream? The fog blanketed the shore. Filled with guilt and worry, Colonel Knox continued to pace back and forth, back and forth. The hours ticked by. Still no sign of the convoy. Henry felt miserable. His daring plan was falling apart. He'd have to go back to Cambridge in disgrace. Suddenly, he froze. Was he imagining things? No. There it was again. A faint voice singing in the fog. "We had a little ship, and she sailed upon the sea, and the name of the ship was the Golden Vanity." The colonel held his breath, and he listened hard. He began to smile as he heard the voice again. "And we thought she would be taken by the Spanish enemy. She sailed upon the lowland, sailed upon the lowland sea." Henry squinted through the gloom. A ghostly line of boats was creeping toward shore. He watched the oars rise and fall as the convoy drew nearer. The lead barge was listing badly, but he could see Will standing in the bow, bailing water and singing in his loud tenor voice. One by one, the barges scraped up on the pebbly shore. As the weary men collapsed over their oars, William climbed ashore and came toward his brother. His face was haggard, and there were dark circles under his eyes. With a big grin, he gave Henry a fancy salute and said, "Ticonderoga Navy, sir, reporting as ordered." At that moment, Colonel Knox had never felt happier. Chapter 8. The Colonel Reports. With the guns safely at Fort George, the next move was to start overland. The pilots who had volunteered for the lake passage were paid, thanked, and sent home. The brothers added a group of men who knew how to handle horses and oxen, and a platoon of soldiers was assigned to the convoy. General Schuyler had kept his word. Many carts and sleds had been sent from Albany, and more were on the way. The sleds were made of thick wooden planks, and the wooden runners were reinforced with iron strips. Some colonists also came to the fort to offer their own sturdy wagons. One of these was a farmer named Becker, who brought his 12-year-old son John with him. John, known as J.P., had begged for a chance to go with his pa, and he became the youngest member of Colonel Knox's team. Becker had signed on for the run to Springfield, Massachusetts, a distance of several hundred miles, and he and J.P. were put in charge of the big brass 9-pounder. It was called that because it could fire a cannonball weighing approximately 9 pounds. 4 strong horses were used to haul this gun on Becker's wagon, but the heaviest weapons, the 18-pounders and the 24-pounders, they needed the pulling weight of 8 oxen yoked in pairs. The scene at the lakefront was chaotic, but there was order in the confusion. J.P., wide-eyed, watched in excitement as the men hoisted cannons onto the sleds, rolled carts into line, studied maps, bridled horses, loaded tools and supplies, and hitched oxen to vehicles. Through it all, Henry and Will were everywhere, shouting orders, helping to load, and keeping an eye on their precious cargo. It wasn't until the next day that Henry could sit down and write to General Washington. His quill pen raced over the paper as he explained the guns had finally reached Fort George. And then he went on. It was not easy to conceive the difficulties we had transporting them across the lake, owing to the advanced season of the year and contrary winds, but that danger is now past. 3 days ago, it was uncertain whether we could have gotten them until next spring, but now Thanks be to God, we can go forward. I have made 42 exceedingly strong sleds. I have had made 42 exceedingly strong sleds and have provided 80 yoke of oxen to drag them as far as Springfield, where I shall get fresh animals to carry them to camp. I expect to move on to Saratoga on Wednesday or Thursday next, trusting that between now and then we shall have a fine fall of snow, which will enable us to proceed further and make the carriage easy. If that shall be the case, I hope in 16 or 17 days' time to be able to present your excellency a noble train of artillery. Henry sealed the note and handed it to a rider who had been standing by. He stepped outside for a last-minute check. Everything was in order. In a little while, the journey would begin. As he finished his inspection, William fell in beside him. The brothers nodded to each other without exchanging any words. There was nothing more to say. The lake trip had been dangerous, but it was behind them. Now they hoped the convoy's worst troubles were over. Thanks for listening.